What if everything you thought you knew about the royal family was a carefully constructed illusion? What if the fairy tale romance of Princess Diana wasn't destroyed by circumstance or bad luck, but by a cold, calculated plan to erase her from the royal picture? Imagine for a moment the quiet halls of Highgrove House in the early 90s. Camilla Parker Bowles sits by the fire, her eyes fixed on the flickering flames, her voice low and measured as she speaks to her then-husband, Andrew Parker Bowles. In a moment of quiet candor, she reportedly mutters words that now echo like a chilling prophecy: Diana won't last. One way or another, she will be gone. At the time, Andrew dismissed it as bitter talk from a woman trapped in a love triangle with no easy escape. But decades later, he claims those words were not idle musings. They were part of a broader scheme. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. This is not just another royal scandal. This is a story that pierces the heart of Britain's most sacred institution and raises a terrifying question. Was the people's princess doomed from the start? And if Andrew Parker Bowles is finally telling the truth, why now? Why break his silence after all these years, knowing the chaos his words could unleash? In this video, we will uncover the explosive claims made by the man who was once married to Camilla, now Queen Consort. Claims that Diana's tragic end was not an accident, but the result of deliberate manipulation and relentless pressure. Claims that Camilla, her inner circle, and even the establishment itself had a vested interest in pushing Diana to the edge, physically, emotionally, and psychologically. But first, let us take you back to the days when Diana was alive, radiant, and utterly unprepared for the storm she was about to face. When Lady Diana Spencer married Prince Charles in 1981, the world erupted in celebration. Her shy smile, dazzling beauty, and apparent innocence captured hearts across the globe. It seemed like a fairy tale unfolding in real life. Yet behind the palace walls, the atmosphere was far from magical. From the very beginning, Diana felt the chill of Camilla's presence. Charles's deep emotional bond with Camilla never faded, even after his marriage. Diana, barely 20 years old, was thrust into an environment where centuries of tradition and silent alliances dictated every move. She later confessed that she felt like a lamb being led to slaughter. Andrew Parker Bowles, Camilla's then-husband and a decorated military officer, found himself caught in the middle of this tangled web. In public, he maintained the stoic demeanor of a royal insider. But in private, he bore witness to whispered conversations and covert meetings that hinted at something far darker than infidelity. According to Andrew, Camilla expressed a determination to remove Diana from the equation. She allegedly believed that Diana's growing popularity was not only a threat to Charles, but to the entire monarchy. The younger woman's magnetism drew attention away from the institution itself, and Camilla, often vilified as the other woman, saw her chances of legitimacy slipping away as long as Diana lived. Andrew reportedly recalled one particular evening in 1995, just after Diana's infamous Panorama interview aired. The interview sent shockwaves through the royal family, as Diana spoke openly about her suffering, her bulimia, and her isolation. Camilla was said to be livid. "She's dangerous," Andrew remembers her saying, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and rage. "She'll destroy everything if we don't stop her." But what could stop her possibly mean? Was this simply the jealous outburst of a woman scorned? Or were Camilla and her confidants laying the groundwork for a relentless campaign of psychological warfare? Andrew claims that from that moment on, he began noticing subtle yet sinister patterns. Diana was increasingly targeted by tabloids with stories portraying her as unstable and erratic. Photographers seemed to appear wherever she went, often in moments that made her appear distressed or overwhelmed. Friends of Diana later admitted she felt hunted, as though she couldn't trust anyone around her. In hindsight, Andrew says, the pressure seemed designed to push Diana into emotional collapse. It was like watching someone being driven into a corner, bit by bit. He reflects somberly. "I didn't realize at the time how deliberate it all felt." Now, years after Diana's tragic death in a Paris tunnel, Andrew Parker Bowles has decided to share what he knows. His confession raises disturbing questions. Why didn't he speak sooner? Was he complicit through his silence? And what does he stand to gain or lose by revealing these secrets now? Some will argue that Andrew's claims are nothing more than an attempt to settle old scores or rewrite history. Others will believe that his words are the long-awaited truth, finally cracking the polished veneer of the House of Windsor. Either way, one thing is certain. Once you hear what Andrew Parker Bowles has to say, you may never look at Diana's story or Camilla's rise to power the same way again. So stay with us as we journey deep into the shadows of the monarchy. We'll uncover the whispers, the power plays, and the alleged schemes that may have sealed Diana's fate long before that fateful night in Paris. And as we peel back the layers of this royal tragedy, one haunting question will linger. Was it all planned? In the summer of 1980, Lady Diana Spencer was just 19 years old, a shy kindergarten assistant living in a modest flat in London. She could not have imagined that within a year, she would be swept into the gilded cage of the British monarchy, her life transformed into a global spectacle. At the time, she was portrayed as a sweet, naive girl with a heart full of love and a future filled with promise. But behind the scenes, forces far greater than her youth and innocence were already at play. Prince Charles, then 31, had begun courting Diana in a manner that seemed hurried and almost strategic. The public adored the idea of the heir to the throne marrying a beautiful, pure-hearted aristocrat. Yet what few realized then was that Charles's heart was elsewhere. In his private moments, his thoughts often turned not to Diana, but to Camilla Parker Bowles, the woman who had been his confidant, lover, and emotional anchor for years. Camilla, meanwhile, was married to Andrew Parker Bowles, a cavalry officer in the British Army and a man accustomed to the rigid codes of silence in upper-class circles. Andrew had long accepted the unconventional dynamics of his marriage. He and Camilla maintained appearances in public, but Andrew was not blind to the fact that Camilla's affections remained tethered to Charles. At first, Andrew did not view Diana as a threat. To him, she was just a sweet, wide-eyed girl stepping into a world she could never fully comprehend. But as Diana's engagement to Charles progressed, Andrew began to notice subtle shifts in Camilla's demeanor. There was an undercurrent of tension whenever Diana's name came up. At dinner parties, Camilla's laughter would falter if the conversation turned to the soon-to-be Princess of Wales. "Do you see how she lights up a room?" Camilla reportedly muttered one evening after watching Diana interviewed on television. "That girl doesn't even have to try, and people adore her." "It's dangerous, Andrew. She's dangerous." Andrew dismissed her words as jealousy. After all, Camilla had long been the woman in Charles's heart, even if not by his side. Why should she fear a teenager stepping into royal life? Yet Camilla seemed to sense something deeper, something Andrew was only beginning to understand. Diana's magnetism was not ordinary. She wasn't just marrying into the royal family. She was becoming its brightest star. At the time, Diana herself was blissfully unaware of the storm brewing around her. In her innocence, she believed Charles loved her. When asked about their relationship in an early interview, Charles gave the now infamous response, "Whatever in love means." Diana, by contrast, beamed and said she adored him. It was a telling moment, but one the public brushed aside. For Andrew, however, it marked a turning point. In the privacy of their home, Camilla fumed over Charles's growing distance. "He'll never be free of me," she said flatly one night, according to Andrew. "Diana can wear the tiaras and smile for the cameras, but she'll never have his soul. That belongs to me." Andrew watched quietly, trying to ignore the unease creeping into his mind. He told himself these were just the bitter musings of a woman grappling with her place in an impossible love triangle. Yet the words stayed with him, echoing ominously as he attended social events where Diana's presence seemed to cast a long, radiant shadow over everyone else. The world could see Diana's charm, but within the royal inner circle, her growing popularity was already stirring resentment. Senior courtiers, steeped in centuries of tradition, whispered that Diana's youth made her unpredictable. Camilla, too, began cultivating allies among these old guard figures. Together, they shared a common anxiety that Diana's luminous presence threatened to outshine the monarchy itself. In retrospect, Andrew recalls the subtle yet significant shift during this time. He describes it as the quiet before a great storm. On the surface, all seemed calm. Diana and Charles's wedding plans were underway. Camilla played the dutiful wife of an army officer, and the public was caught up in the romance of it all. But beneath the calm exterior, resentment simmered. Camilla confided in Andrew about her fears that Diana would turn Charles against his true self, pulling him away from the traditions that anchored the crown. One evening, as they sat in the drawing room of their Wiltshire home, Camilla reportedly spoke words that Andrew could never forget. "She doesn't belong here, Andrew," Camilla said, her voice low and deliberate. And if she stays, she will destroy everything. You'll see. Andrew looked at his wife, unsure whether she meant Diana would destroy the royal family or whether the family itself would destroy Diana. At the time, he didn't press her for clarification. He poured himself another glass of whiskey, hoping to drown the creeping sense of dread in his stomach. It would be years before Andrew fully grasped the implications of that conversation. But even then, a part of him sensed that forces were moving quietly, inexorably, against Diana. Forces that viewed her not as a cherished member of the royal family, but as an interloper who had to be neutralized, one way or another. This was the calm before the storm. A period where smiles hid daggers and alliances were forged in whispers behind closed doors. Diana was dancing into the palace, radiant and full of hope, utterly unaware of the invisible net slowly closing around her. And Andrew Parker Bowles, though not yet fully awake to the danger, was already positioned as a silent witness to the most chilling drama the royal family had ever known. The early years of Diana's marriage to Prince Charles were painted in soft pastel shades for the public. The glowing bride, the doting husband, the fairy tale couple touring the globe, their every move chronicled by a hungry press. But away from the camera flashes and the adoring crowds, a very different reality began to unfold. One where whispered conversations and private meetings told a story the world wasn't meant to hear. And at the center of those secrets sat Camilla Parker Bowles, carefully observing from the shadows, her web of influence growing tighter with each passing day. For Andrew Parker Bowles, these were years of quiet discomfort. His marriage to Camilla had long settled into a cold routine. To outsiders, they seemed like any other well-matched couple from Britain's privileged class. But Andrew knew better. He knew that Camilla's heart had never truly belonged to him. It had always been tethered to Charles, and by extension, to the swirling chaos of the royal family. At first, Andrew tried to ignore the hints that something larger was brewing. Camilla spent long hours on the telephone, her voice hushed but firm, speaking in coded phrases he didn't understand. She hosted discreet lunches with old friends from her aristocratic circle, women who had been raised among royalty, who knew the unspoken rules of survival in Britain's upper echelons. On one such afternoon in late 1983, Andrew returned home earlier than expected. As he stepped into the sitting room, he overheard snippets of conversation that froze him in place. "Diana's becoming a problem," a woman's voice murmured. "She's too emotional, too unpredictable," Camilla replied. "It's dangerous for the family." There was a pause, the sound of a teacup being set down. Then Camilla's voice again, softer this time but edged with something that made Andrew's stomach tighten. "She won't last, not like this. One way or another, she'll be gone." Andrew felt a chill run through him. He could have walked in then, could have confronted them, demanded an explanation. But he didn't. He turned quietly and retreated to his study, pouring himself a stiff drink and trying to convince himself that he had misheard. In the weeks that followed, Andrew began noticing more details that disturbed him. Camilla's friends spoke in hushed tones when he entered a room. Notes and letters arrived bearing royal crests, which she would quickly tuck away. Once, he found her burning papers in the fireplace. When he asked what they were, she smiled thinly and said, "Just old correspondence. Nothing you'd be interested in." But Andrew couldn't shake the feeling that something darker was unfolding. It was around this time that Diana's private struggles began seeping into public view. Behind the palace gates, she battled bulimia, loneliness, and an overwhelming sense of isolation. She confided in her closest friends that she felt like an outsider in her own marriage. Charles, she said, was emotionally distant, often retreating to his private quarters for hours on end. And Camilla, always Camilla, loomed large in the background, a constant reminder that Diana would never fully possess her husband's heart. Andrew watched as Camilla became increasingly emboldened in her relationship with Charles. While Diana struggled, Camilla seemed to move with quiet confidence, cultivating relationships with key figures in the royal household. There were late-night phone calls, clandestine meetings, and strategic alliances that even Andrew couldn't fully understand. In private moments, Camilla's tone towards Diana grew colder, more calculating. "She's fragile, Andrew," Camilla said one evening, swirling a glass of red wine. "She can't handle the pressures of this life. She's going to crack, and when she does, Charles will come running back to me. It's only a matter of time." Andrew stared at her, unsure whether to feel anger or pity. "You sound like you want her to fail," he said carefully. Camilla's eyes flicked to his, calm and unblinking. "I don't need to want it. It's inevitable." Those words haunted him. As months turned into years, the tension between Diana and the royal family escalated. The press, once enchanted by the young princess, began publishing stories portraying her as unstable and erratic. Andrew would later wonder if this was mere coincidence, or if Camilla and her allies were feeding the tabloids information to turn public opinion against Diana. Andrew also recalled an incident that, at the time, he tried to forget. In 1987, at a quiet country estate, Camilla hosted a small gathering of trusted confidants. After dinner, as the conversation turned to Diana's latest struggles, one guest remarked, "She's too clever for her own good. If she keeps pushing, the palace will have no choice but to protect itself." Camilla responded with a thin smile. "Exactly. The institution always wins. Diana should remember that." Andrew felt a cold sweat on the back of his neck. It was the way she said it, too. Calm, certain, as though Diana's downfall was not only likely but already in motion. In public, Diana continued to play her role. She smiled for cameras, embraced sick children in hospitals, and spoke passionately about her charitable causes. But in private, her despair deepened. Friends described how she would cry for hours, terrified of the forces she felt arrayed against her. Andrew, too, began to feel the weight of those forces. He watched as Camilla's influence within the royal circle grew stronger, as if she were weaving a net that drew Charles closer and pushed Diana further into isolation. There was one night, years later, when Andrew would finally voice his fears. "Did you have something to do with her undoing?" he asked quietly, unable to keep the question buried any longer. Camilla looked at him for a long moment before turning away. "She wasn't built for this world, Andrew. No one needed to push her. She did it to herself." But Andrew wasn't so sure. Looking back, he now wonders if Diana ever truly stood a chance. Whether, from the moment she entered the royal family, there was an unspoken plan to break her spirit and remove her from the picture. These secrets behind closed doors would remain buried for years. But as Andrew Parker Bowles begins to speak now, the truth, whatever it may be, is starting to surface. And it's far more chilling than anyone imagined. The British tabloids have long been described as ruthless, their appetite for scandal and sensation insatiable. But for Diana, Princess of Wales, they were more than an annoyance. They became a weapon, one she could never fully escape, and one Andrew Parker Bowles now suggests may have been deliberately turned against her by forces inside the royal circle. In the early years, Diana and the press had an almost symbiotic relationship. She was the most photographed woman in the world. Her every outfit, every smile, every tear splashed across newspaper covers from London to Los Angeles. The cameras adored her, and for a time, she seemed to welcome them as allies in her role as the people's princess. But as her marriage began to crumble and her emotional state grew fragile, that relationship shifted dramatically. Andrew Parker Bowles claims he began noticing troubling patterns during this period, patterns he now believes were not accidental. "I'd hear Camilla on the phone with journalists she trusted," Andrew recalls. "She'd speak in riddles, but the intent was clear. Focus on Diana's moods, or look at how she behaves in public." There were times I wondered if they were laying the groundwork to make her appear unstable. At the time, Andrew told himself these were just cynical tactics in an ugly love triangle. But as the months passed, he began to suspect something larger was at play. By 1992, the British press had begun publishing stories that painted Diana in a very different light. Headlines screamed of her alleged tantrums, her struggles with bulimia, and her supposed inability to handle the pressures of royal life. Paparazzi swarmed her at every turn, snapping photos of her looking exhausted, distraught, or simply alone. Was it coincidence? Or were these moments carefully orchestrated? One evening in early 1993, Andrew walked into the drawing room to find Camilla sipping a glass of sherry, a newspaper folded neatly in her lap. The front page carried a photo of Diana leaving a hospital in tears after visiting a sick child. The headline read, "Princess breaks down again. Is Diana cracking under pressure?" "She's unraveling," Camilla said softly, almost to herself. Then she looked up at Andrew and added, "She can't handle the scrutiny. The press will eat her alive." Andrew shifted uncomfortably. "And you're fine with that?" he asked. Camilla's gaze was steady. "It's not my doing. The media are like wolves. They hunt the weakest in the pack. Diana's giving them the sin of blood." But Andrew wasn't convinced. Over the next several months, he overheard more conversations that made his skin crawl. Camilla spoke often with certain editors and columnists, feeding them tidbits about Diana's supposed instability, her emotional outbursts, and her growing desperation in her marriage. "She's reckless, Andrew," Camilla said one night as she hung up the phone. If she doesn't stop, she'll destroy Charles. She'll destroy all of us. Andrew felt a chill in the room that had nothing to do with the weather. The turning point came in 1995, when Diana sat down with journalist Martin Bashir for the now infamous Panorama interview. With calm defiance, she revealed her suffering to the world, her struggles with bulimia, her feelings of betrayal, and her isolation within the royal family. "There were 3 of us in this marriage," Diana said quietly, her words slicing through the air like a blade. So it was a bit crowded. That interview was watched by nearly 23 million people in Britain alone. For Diana's supporters, it was an act of courage. But for her enemies, it was an act of war. Andrew remembers Camilla's reaction vividly. She was pacing the living room, her face pale with fury as Diana's words echoed from the television. "She's dangerous," Camilla muttered. "She's turning the world against us. This can't go on." Andrew didn't dare ask what she meant. In the months that followed, the media attacks on Diana intensified. Paparazzi seemed to appear wherever she went. Rumors swirled of affairs, erratic behavior, and even unfitness as a mother. Friends of Diana said she began to fear her phone was tapped, her movements tracked, her life manipulated in ways she couldn't comprehend. She felt hunted, one of Diana's confidants later said. Like an animal in a trap. Andrew began to notice a new tone in Camilla's voice when she spoke of Diana. It was no longer tinged with jealousy but something colder, almost clinical. "Let her make a spectacle of herself," Camilla said one evening. "The public will turn on her soon enough." But the public didn't turn. If anything, Diana's vulnerability only deepened their affection for her. Andrew now believes this unexpected loyalty from the public may have pushed the royal establishment to escalate their efforts. The media became a chessboard, he reflects. Diana was the queen, and they wanted to corner her, take her out of the game. But she kept moving, kept finding ways to survive. There was one incident Andrew recalls with chilling clarity. A tabloid photographer had chased Diana's car through the streets of London late one night, forcing her driver to swerve dangerously to avoid a collision. The next day's headlines screamed, "Diana's wild ride, reckless princess or media victim?" Andrew overheard Camilla discussing the event with a close friend over the phone. "She's going to destroy herself at this rate," Camilla said. "It might be for the best." It was that phrase, "for the best," that lodged in Andrew's mind and refused to leave. Looking back, he wonders whether the relentless media pursuit of Diana was purely the result of tabloid greed or whether it was guided, subtly but deliberately, by powerful hands determined to break her spirit. And if it was guided, he asks himself in quiet moments, how far would those hands go to remove the most beloved woman in the world from the stage forever? By the mid-1990s, the sparkle that once seemed to follow Diana everywhere began to dim. To the public, she was still the radiant people's princess, but behind closed doors, her life was becoming a labyrinth of loneliness, fear, and betrayal. What few realized then, and what Andrew Parker Bowles now claims to have witnessed in fragments, was how carefully orchestrated that isolation may have been. In those years, Diana often spoke of being surrounded by people yet feeling completely alone. The royal palaces, with their ornate halls and gilded chambers, had become like prison walls. She confided in friends that she felt watched, judged, and perpetually on trial for simply trying to exist within a system that never welcomed her. Andrew, still bound to Camilla at the time, recalls seeing this dynamic unfold from a unique vantage point. As Camilla grew more entangled with Charles and his inner circle, she also became a key player in the quiet but effective campaign to neutralize Diana's influence. "She's a threat to the firm," Camilla said one night as she sat by the window of their home, staring out into the darkness. Andrew had grown accustomed to these late-night reflections, her voice calm but edged with purpose. "What do you mean by that?" Andrew asked carefully. Camilla sipped her wine before replying. "She doesn't play by the rules. She's too emotional, too independent. If she doesn't toe the line, they'll have no choice but to sideline her. It's how the system survives." Andrew felt an unease settle in his chest. He had heard whispers in aristocratic circles of how problematic royals were quietly managed, stripped of influence, pushed to the margins, or simply erased from relevance. But this was Diana. She wasn't just any royal. She was adored worldwide. Surely the establishment wouldn't risk a war with the public to bring her down. But as time passed, Andrew began to wonder if that war had already started. There were subtle moves, almost invisible to the untrained eye, that began tightening the walls around Diana. Friends who had been close to her suddenly distanced themselves, either by choice or under pressure. Staff members loyal to her were quietly reassigned or dismissed. Invitations to key royal events grew fewer, her place in the family hierarchy shrinking with each passing month. Andrew remembers attending a private function where Diana's absence was conspicuous. When he asked why she wasn't there, Camilla replied curtly, "She wasn't invited. She creates scenes. No one wants her here." But Andrew suspected there was more to it than that. He noticed how often Diana's name would surface in conversations among the inner circle, not as a loved family member, but as a problem to be solved. "She's unpredictable," one courtier was heard saying. "We can't control her." That's dangerous. To Andrew, the tone was chilling. It wasn't frustration. It was strategy. Meanwhile, Diana's emotional state was deteriorating. She was trapped in a loveless marriage, haunted by the knowledge that Charles's heart belonged elsewhere, and tormented by a press that seemed determined to amplify her every mistake. "I feel like I'm going mad," Diana reportedly told a friend in tears. "It's like they want me to break." Andrew would later recall how Camilla reacted when she heard about Diana's confessions. "She's playing the victim," Camilla said with an air of disdain. "If she can't handle the pressure, she shouldn't have married into this family." She was warned. But Andrew wasn't so sure. In the rare moments he encountered Diana, at formal events, fleeting conversations in corridors, he saw not a schemer but a young woman desperately trying to hold herself together in a world that seemed intent on crushing her. One memory in particular haunted him. It was at a charity gala in 1994. Diana arrived late, her eyes slightly puffy as if she had been crying. Yet the moment she stepped out of her car, she transformed. She smiled warmly at waiting crowds, embraced children with genuine tenderness, and posed for photographers with the grace of a seasoned star. But when she entered the building and the cameras were gone, Andrew saw her expression collapse. She looked hollow, Andrew recalls, as if she was wearing a mask that had grown too heavy to bear. That night, Camilla made a remark that still echoes in Andrew's memory. "See how she plays them," she said, gesturing to the flashes of cameras outside. "She's not as fragile as she pretends, but she'll slip eventually. They always do." The "they" in Camilla's sentence disturbed Andrew. It was said with the cold detachment of someone watching a game unfold, confident in the eventual outcome. Andrew began noticing how Diana's every move seemed to be anticipated and countered. When Diana sought solace in her charity work, stories emerged questioning her motives. When she tried to carve out an independent role, whispers spread that she was going rogue. And when she began relationships outside her marriage, tabloids painted her as reckless, even immoral. It was like watching someone being slowly suffocated, Andrew says now. She was surrounded, and she didn't even know who was tightening the noose. In private, Diana confessed to friends that she feared her phone was being tapped, her staff spying on her, her life manipulated by unseen forces. Many dismissed these fears as paranoia at the time. But Andrew now wonders if she was right all along. Was Diana's growing isolation a natural result of her choices, as her critics claimed? Or was it engineered by an inner circle determined to strip her of allies, options, and ultimately, her sanity? For Andrew Parker Bowles, the answer seems clear now. They didn't need to kill her outright, he says quietly. They just had to make her so alone that she'd destroy herself. Or so desperate that she'd take risks no one else would take. Either way, she was doomed. And yet, despite it all, Diana kept fighting, searching for love, seeking purpose, and refusing to completely surrender to the forces closing in around her. It is in this fragile, defiant state that she entered the final chapter of her life. A chapter that, Andrew believes, was as carefully managed as everything that came before it. In the years since Diana's death, the world has debated endlessly whether her demise was a tragic accident or something far more sinister. Conspiracy theories flourished, investigations were launched, and official reports declared her passing in Paris a result of reckless driving and a relentless press. But Andrew Parker Bowles now claims that long before that fateful night, the seeds of Diana's downfall had already been sown, and it wasn't mere chance that drove her into the tunnel where her life ended. It was, in his words, carefully calculated. Andrew recalls a chilling conversation he overheard one autumn evening in the early 1990s, not long after Charles and Diana's marriage had descended into public dysfunction. Camilla was hosting a private dinner at their country home in Wiltshire, attended by a small group of her most trusted friends and allies. Women and men who had spent their lives navigating the labyrinth of Britain's aristocracy and who understood how to protect their own. Andrew hadn't been invited to the dinner, but as he walked past the closed drawing room doors, snippets of conversation drifted to his ears. She's an unpredictable element, one voice said. If we don't manage her, she'll pull the whole family down with her, another murmured. Then Camilla's voice, low but unmistakably clear, Diana won't last. She can't. It's her, or the crown. Andrew froze in the hallway. The words struck him like a thunderclap. At the time, he tried to rationalize what he'd heard. Perhaps Camilla was just speaking in anger, venting her frustrations in the company of friends. But there was something about her tone, measured, calm, almost resigned, that made his skin crawl. Later that evening, as they sat alone, Andrew cautiously broached the subject. What did you mean when you said Diana won't last? He asked. Camilla didn't look up from her glass of wine. She's on a collision course with the monarchy, Andrew. And there's only ever one winner in those battles. Are you saying you want her gone? I'm saying, Camilla said evenly, that if she keeps playing this game, she will be gone. One way or another. Andrew felt an icy dread settle over him. He didn't press further. He didn't want to know more. Over time, he began noticing other small but disturbing signs that suggested Camilla's words were not mere conjecture. There were phone calls at odd hours, secretive meetings, and hushed discussions with individuals who wielded significant influence within Britain's elite circles. Andrew recalls one particularly ominous remark from a senior courtier, overheard during a charity gala. Sometimes the crown must protect itself, the man said, swirling his brandy. Sacrifices are necessary to preserve the institution. Sacrifices. At the time, Andrew didn't connect the dots. But as Diana's troubles deepened, as her life became more chaotic and her public image was repeatedly tarnished, Andrew began to wonder if those sacrifices were already in motion. In private moments, Camilla's attitude toward Diana grew colder, more detached. The jealousy that had once fueled her bitterness seemed to have evolved into a calculated acceptance that Diana's fate was sealed. She doesn't belong here, Camilla said one night as she thumbed through a stack of letters. She never did. This world will chew her up and spit her out. Andrew tried to challenge her. That doesn't mean she deserves what's happening to her. Camilla looked at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. Deserve has nothing to do with it. It was then that Andrew realized Camilla was no longer simply reacting to events. She was part of them. The campaign against Diana seemed to escalate in the mid-1990s. Friends who had once supported her drifted away, and key staff members were reassigned or removed. Even the press, which had once worshipped her, turned more hostile, running stories that portrayed her as erratic and unfit for royal life. Andrew believes this was not coincidence. Her isolation wasn't an accident, he says now. It was manufactured. They didn't need to kill her outright. They just needed to push her to the brink, make her desperate enough to take risks that could be her undoing. As Diana's marriage crumbled and her mental health faltered, she began seeking comfort in relationships outside the royal family. First James Hewitt, then Dodi Fayed. These relationships, Andrew believes, gave the inner circle all the ammunition they needed. She played into their hands, he says sadly. Every move she made, they used it against her. Every mistake became proof that she was unfit, unstable, dangerous. Then came the summer of 1997. Diana's romance with Dodi was plastered across the tabloids, their every kiss and embrace photographed by an army of paparazzi. To some, it was the story of a woman rediscovering love after years of heartbreak. To others, it was the final provocation, the moment when Diana became too unpredictable, too independent, too threatening to the status quo. Andrew recalls a chilling comment Camilla made shortly before Diana's trip to Paris with Dodi. She's playing with fire, Camilla said over breakfast, her tone clipped. And you know what happens when you play with fire. When news of Diana's death broke in the early hours of August 31st, 1997, Andrew felt a strange mix of shock and inevitability. Camilla's reaction was even more unsettling. She said nothing for a long time, staring out the window at the gray morning sky. Then, almost under her breath, she murmured, "It was always going to end like this." Andrew felt a chill crawl up his spine. For years, he kept these memories to himself, suppressing them in the hope that the truth would never fully surface. But now, as he reflects on those dark days, he believes the world deserves to know. They didn't crash the car themselves, Andrew says. But they built the road that led her there. They created the chaos, the pressure, the isolation. They made her desperate. And then they sat back and waited. And in that waiting, Diana's fate was sealed. By the mid-1990s, Diana's public persona and private reality had split into two irreconcilable halves. To millions across the globe, she remained the luminous people's princess, a figure of compassion and elegance who seemed to float above the turmoil of royal life. But behind the carefully arranged smiles and polished appearances, she was fighting a silent war, one she feared she was losing. Andrew Parker Bowles recalls this period as one of profound unease. Though no longer married to Camilla, he remained tethered to the royal orbit through old friendships and social connections. And from that vantage point, he began to hear whispers that chilled him to his core. Diana's unstable. One courtier reportedly remarked at a private function, "She's not fit for the pressures of the crown. If she doesn't pull herself together, she'll bring the whole house down with her." It was a refrain Andrew heard more than once in those years. "She's crying for help in public now," Camilla had said after Diana's confessional interview with Martin Bashir in 1995. But in this family, crying for help is like signing your own death warrant. Andrew couldn't shake the memory of those words as Diana began stepping further outside the boundaries expected of a royal. She was no longer content to be the dutiful wife, silently suffering while Charles's relationship with Camilla flourished. Instead, Diana began carving her own path. Through charity work, public appearances, and, increasingly, her own narrative in the press. But her moves came at a price. By this time, Diana felt surrounded by enemies. Her phone calls were plagued by clicks and echoes, leading her to suspect she was being monitored. Her letters, she claimed, sometimes went missing or arrived opened. Even her own staff seemed divided in their loyalties, some devoted to her, others more aligned with the institution she was challenging. Andrew remembers hearing of Diana's growing paranoia from mutual acquaintances. But in retrospect, he wonders, was it truly paranoia, or was it insight into a reality too sinister for most to accept? One evening, at a dinner hosted by an old army friend, Andrew overheard a chilling conversation between two men with close ties to the royal household. "She's poking the hornet's nest," one said. "Does she really think she can win?" "Let her keep poking," the other replied. "Sooner or later, she'll get stung." Diana herself seemed to understand that she was treading dangerous ground. In a private letter to her butler Paul Burrell, later revealed to the public, she wrote, "They are planning an accident in my car, brake failure, and serious head injury in order to make the path clear for Charles to marry." At the time, many dismissed the note as evidence of Diana's fragile mental state. But Andrew now wonders if it was a desperate cry for help from a woman who sensed she was being hunted. She wasn't delusional, Andrew says quietly. She was perceptive. She saw the trap closing around her. In the months leading up to her death, Diana's behavior grew more erratic. She changed her schedule frequently, canceled appointments at the last minute, and took unusual precautions when traveling. Friends described her as alternately fearful and defiant, certain that forces were conspiring against her but determined to outmaneuver them. She knew she was being watched, one close friend later recalled. She felt like there were eyes on her everywhere she went. Andrew remembers hearing from one of Camilla's old AC. Yet even in her darkest moments, Diana continued to fight for control of her life. Her work with AIDS patients, landmine victims, and other humanitarian causes gave her purpose and a sense of agency. But Andrew believes these very efforts may have heightened the determination of her detractors to silence her. She was becoming too powerful in her own right, he reflects. She didn't need the royal family anymore. That made her dangerous. As the summer of 1997 approached, Diana began spending more time abroad, seeking solace in travel and companionship with Dodi Fayed. Their romance, heavily covered by the tabloids, was seen by some as Diana's attempt to start fresh. But Andrew now believes it may also have been her final act of defiance, a declaration that she could live without the crown. And that, he says, may have been the ultimate provocation. "I think she underestimated how far they would go to protect the institution," Andrew says. She believed her status as the mother of a future king would shield her. But in that world, nothing and no one is truly untouchable. In her final weeks, Diana seemed to oscillate between hope and despair. In one moment, she would speak of her dreams for a new life, free from royal obligations. In the next, she would tell friends she feared for her safety, voicing suspicions that her movements were being tracked. And then, on that August night in Paris, her fears came to a devastating fruition. To the world, Diana's death was a shocking tragedy. To Andrew, it felt like the closing act of a play whose script had been written long before. She cried for help, he says softly, but no one listened. Or maybe they listened too well. The summer of 1997 began with sunlight and laughter for Diana, but beneath the golden glow, an ominous shadow trailed her every step. To the outside world, she seemed liberated. Her divorce from Charles finalized, her royal duties behind her, and her heart seemingly aflame with a new romance. Yet those closest to her would later say there was an edge to her joy, a wariness in her eyes, as though she sensed that her time was running out. Andrew Parker Bowles remembers this period vividly, not because he was near Diana in her final months, but because the echoes of conversations he'd overheard in previous years seemed to come rushing back with frightening clarity. "She thinks she's finally free," Camilla had said weeks before Diana's Paris trip, her voice tinged with an odd mixture of amusement and warning. "But she isn't. She never will be." Andrew didn't press her for meaning. He didn't want to. As Diana sailed on Dodi Fayed's yacht off the Mediterranean coast, cameras followed her relentlessly. The tabloids screamed of a whirlwind romance. Diana and Dodi kissing under the sun, holding hands on deck, laughing like teenagers in love. To her admirers, these images symbolized hope, renewal, and escape. But to others, especially those within the palace walls, they signaled danger. There were whispers in rarefied circles that Diana's relationship with Dodi posed a threat not only to royal dignity, but to the very fabric of the monarchy. "She's making a spectacle of herself," Camilla remarked one evening as she flipped through a magazine, its cover showing Diana draped in a swimsuit, smiling toward the horizon. "Does she think this will end well?" "It won't." Andrew, nursing a drink in the same room, felt a strange chill at her words. When he later discussed Diana's summer escapades with an acquaintance connected to the royal household, the man spoke with an unsettling frankness. "She's becoming too unpredictable. This isn't about Charles anymore. It's about the crown. If she marries Dodi, imagine the implications, the mother of a future king tied to an Egyptian billionaire, a Muslim no less. It's unthinkable to some people in that world." Andrew listened in silence, a cold knot forming in his stomach. By mid-August, Diana's phone calls to friends had taken on an anxious tone. She confided that she felt hounded and expressed fears of being watched even in private spaces. Photographers seemed to know her movements in advance, arriving at her destinations before she did. Some friends dismissed her worries as paranoia, but others began to wonder if she was right. She felt trapped, one confidant would later say. She wanted freedom, but everywhere she turned, there were cameras, there were whispers, there were threats. In Paris, Diana's sense of foreboding deepened. She told her bodyguard, Trevor Rees-Jones, that she believed her phone was bugged. She even remarked to Dodi that she feared they were planning something. "They think I'm a threat," she allegedly said, "and they're not going to stop until I'm gone." Andrew learned of these comments weeks later from an old friend in the diplomatic service. At the time, he dismissed them as the ramblings of a woman under immense stress. But now, years later, he isn't so sure. "She wasn't imagining it," Andrew says quietly. "I believe she sensed what was coming." The night of August 30th seemed unremarkable at first. Diana and Dodi dined at the Ritz in Paris before attempting to slip away from the paparazzi by taking a car from the hotel's back entrance. Henri Paul, the deputy head of security at the Ritz, drove the black Mercedes while Trevor Rees-Jones sat in the front passenger seat. Diana and Dodi settled into the back. Andrew recalls hearing the news hours later, awoken by a phone call just after midnight. The voice on the line was calm but urgent. "There's been an accident in Paris," the caller said. "Diana's involved. It looks bad." Camilla, standing in her nightgown nearby, said nothing as Andrew relayed the message. When he hung up, she asked only one question. "Is she dead?" When Andrew nodded, Camilla turned away, her expression unreadable. "She was never going to survive this world," she murmured, almost to herself. Andrew didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The news spread like wildfire. Diana was gone, her life extinguished in the Pont de l'Alma tunnel, her body crumpled in a wrecked car beneath the weight of flashing bulbs and screeching tires. To millions, it felt like a bad dream from which they could not wake. In the days that followed, Andrew watched as Britain erupted in grief and rage. Mourners lined the streets with flowers, candles, and handwritten notes. The royal family, initially silent, faced mounting criticism for their perceived coldness. But within Camilla's inner circle, the mood was different. There was no public display of mourning, no emotional breakdowns. Instead, there was an eerie calm, almost as if a storm had passed and the air was still. She brought this on herself, Andrew overheard one associate say at a private gathering days later. She kept provoking the beast. She should have known it would bite back. Andrew wanted to scream, to shake them, to demand how they could speak so dispassionately about a young woman's death. But he said nothing. He felt complicit in his silence, haunted by every conversation he had ignored, every warning he had brushed aside. Years later, as he recounts these events, Andrew's voice trembles. They didn't chase her through that tunnel, he says. They didn't make the car crash. But they created the chaos that led her there. And they knew it would end this way. For Diana, the fatal summer of 1997 was meant to be a season of rebirth, a time to reclaim her life. Instead, it became her final chapter, a chapter Andrew Parker Bowles now believes was written long before she set foot in Paris. The air in Paris that evening was heavy with humidity, thick with the scent of car exhaust and the distant murmur of nightlife. For Diana, it was supposed to be another fleeting moment of escape, another chance to outrun the chaos of her old world, to find some semblance of peace in the arms of Dodi Fayed. Yet as the clock ticked closer to midnight on August 30th, 1997, forces beyond her control were aligning in ways no one could have imagined. Andrew Parker Bowles remembers that night not for what he saw, but for what he heard, and for the suffocating dread that settled over him as the news broke. It began, for Andrew, with the ring of a telephone. It was shortly after midnight in Wiltshire. He and Camilla were both awake, restless in the heat of an English summer night. Camilla was reading in bed, her reading glasses perched low on her nose. Andrew was pacing the room, unable to shake an unnameable sense of unease. Then the shrill sound of the phone cut through the stillness. Andrew answered. On the other end was an old military acquaintance, now working in diplomatic security. The voice was calm, but there was an unmistakable undercurrent of tension. Andrew, I thought you'd want to know. There's been an incident in Paris. Diana's involved. A car crash. It looks bad. Andrew froze, gripping the receiver so tightly his knuckles whitened. Is she alive? He asked, his voice tight. They're not sure, came the reply. But the situation doesn't look promising. They're rushing her to the hospital now. Camilla looked up from her book, her eyes narrowing. What is it? She asked. Andrew hesitated before answering. It's Diana. There's been an accident. For a long moment, Camilla said nothing. Then, almost coldly, she asked, Is she dead? Andrew shook his head. Not yet. Camilla exhaled sharply through her nose and looked away, her expression unreadable. Andrew stayed on the line as long as he could, desperate for updates. The minutes dragged like hours. Outside, a dog barked in the distance. Inside, the air felt thick and suffocating. Then came the words that would change everything. She didn't make it. Andrew set the phone down slowly, his hands trembling. Camilla's face was pale. She asked no further questions. Instead, she stood, walked to the window, and stared out into the dark countryside. She was never going to survive this world, she said softly. No matter what anyone did. Andrew felt a chill run down his spine. The following hours passed in a haze. News reports began trickling in. Diana's car had crashed in the Pont de l'Alma tunnel, pursued by a pack of paparazzi. Henri Paul, the driver, was reportedly intoxicated. Dodi Fayed was killed instantly. Diana had been alive when rescuers reached her but succumbed to her injuries hours later at the Petit-Salpêtrière hospital. Andrew couldn't sleep. He sat in the study, nursing glass after glass of whiskey, replaying in his mind every conversation he had overheard over the years. Every warning. Every cold remark about Diana's fragility and recklessness. And one phrase in particular echoed like a curse. One way or another, she'll be gone. The next morning, the world awoke to shock and grief. Britain was plunged into collective mourning. Outside Kensington Palace, flowers piled up in mountains of color and fragrance. Strangers wept openly in the streets. News anchors struggled to hold back tears as they announced the death of the princess who had once seemed untouchable. But within the royal circle, the response was markedly different. Andrew was invited to a discreet gathering at a country estate days later, attended by various figures with ties to the palace. He went, though a part of him wished he hadn't. She was a loose cannon, one man said, swirling his brandy. It was only a matter of time before she brought down the whole institution. Better it ended now than dragged on for years, another added. Andrew felt a surge of nausea. He stood, excused himself, and walked out into the crisp evening air, his hands shaking. The conversations haunted him. They weren't mourning Diana. They were analyzing her downfall as if it had been inevitable, even necessary. And Camilla? Camilla maintained her usual composure. In public, she said nothing, aware of the tidal wave of public anger that might crash down upon her if she showed even a flicker of triumph. In private, she was more circumspect. She wasn't cut out for that life, Camilla said to Andrew late one night. It's tragic, but it was always going to end badly. Andrew didn't answer. Years later, as he reflects on that night, Andrew struggles to reconcile what he knows with what he suspects. I don't believe they staged the crash, he says slowly. But they created the circumstances. The pressure. The chaos. They let the dogs loose and stood back to watch. In his quietest moments, he wonders if someone had intervened earlier, if the relentless pursuit, the whispers, the betrayals had stopped, could Diana have survived? Or was her fate sealed long before she ever stepped into that car in Paris? For Andrew, the question remains unanswered. But the guilt lingers all the same. I didn't speak then, he says, his voice breaking. And now it's too late. In the aftermath of Diana's death, Britain was a nation awash in grief. Millions of mourners lined the streets, clutching flowers and photographs of the woman who had captivated the world with her beauty, vulnerability, and unflinching humanity. Candles flickered in windows across the country. The air was heavy, not just with sorrow, but with anger at the paparazzi, at the royal family's silence, and, in some corners, at the woman many still considered the interloper in Diana's fairy tale. Camilla Parker Bowles. But while the nation mourned, Andrew Parker Bowles began to observe something unsettling. Behind palace walls, the machinery of monarchy had not stopped. It had simply shifted gears. People think the royal family was paralyzed by Diana's death, Andrew says quietly. But that's not how it works. The institution is built to survive anything, even her. For Camilla, Diana's tragic passing was not met with celebration. It would have been unthinkable, even for her. But there was an undeniable sense of relief. The obstacle that had cast such a long shadow over her relationship with Charles was gone. And with that obstacle removed, the path forward, while treacherous, was suddenly clearer. In those early days after the accident, Camilla kept a low profile. Public sentiment was still raw. Diana's face was everywhere, on every television screen, every newspaper cover. Any sign of triumph, any misstep, would have provoked fury from a public still loyal to the memory of the people's princess. She knew she couldn't be seen, Andrew recalls. She understood that the court of public opinion was more powerful than any royal decree. So she waited. And wait she did. Camilla retreated to her Wiltshire home, emerging rarely, speaking only to a small circle of trusted friends. Andrew remembers visiting her during this period. She seemed subdued, almost cautious, he says. But there was also a sense of quiet determination. She wasn't grieving Diana. She was calculating. The royal family itself was in damage control mode. Queen Elizabeth, known for her unflappable stoicism, was criticized for remaining in Balmoral with Prince Charles and the young princes, William and Harry, rather than returning immediately to London. When the Queen finally addressed the nation in a televised speech, her words were measured, careful, and designed to calm the mounting public outrage. In the meantime, Charles faced the daunting task of balancing his role as a grieving ex-husband, a father to two devastated boys, and the man determined to legitimize his relationship with Camilla. It was a delicate dance, Andrew explains. Charles loved Camilla. That much was clear. But he also understood that the world wasn't ready to forgive her, not yet. Over the next few years, Camilla and Charles began a careful campaign to rehabilitate her image. The strategy was subtle but effective. First, a gradual increase in Camilla's public appearances alongside Charles, framed as supportive and discreet. Then, carefully placed stories in friendly newspapers portraying Camilla not as the scheming mistress, but as Charles's steadfast companion, someone who had endured years of media vilification with dignity. Andrew, watching from the sidelines, couldn't help but notice how well orchestrated it all seemed. She had powerful allies, he says. Courtiers, PR experts, even certain journalists. Together, they constructed a narrative. Camilla wasn't the other woman anymore. She was the woman Charles had always loved, the one who had suffered in silence while Diana captivated the world. But for many, the wounds left by Diana's death ran too deep to be so easily healed. In the late 1990s, opinion polls consistently showed that a majority of Britons opposed the idea of Camilla ever becoming queen. Some said they would never forgive her for her role in Diana's misery. Others whispered that she had been part of the machinery that drove Diana to her tragic end. Andrew recalls hearing such whispers at private gatherings. There were those who said it outright, he remembers, that Camilla had known, or at least suspected, what was coming. That she had stood by and let it happen because it served her interests. When asked if he believes those claims, Andrew pauses for a long moment before replying. I don't know if she had foreknowledge, he admits, but I do know she benefited from it. By the early 2000s, Camilla's transformation was nearly complete. In 2005, after years of careful image management, she and Charles married in a civil ceremony at Windsor Guildhall. Camilla became the Duchess of Cornwall, not Princess of Wales, a deliberate choice meant to avoid inflaming public sentiment tied to Diana's title. It was a masterstroke, Andrew says. They avoided direct comparison with Diana, at least for a while. Even so, questions lingered in the minds of many. Could Camilla ever step fully into Diana's shoes? Could she ever be accepted as queen? For Andrew, watching Camilla ascend to her new role stirred conflicting emotions. Part of me admired her, he admits. She played a long game and won. But another part of me felt sick. I couldn't stop thinking about all the conversations I'd overheard years earlier. About how Diana would never last. About how the crown always protects itself. Now, as Camilla sits alongside Charles as queen consort, Andrew wonders if the world will ever know the full story of how she got there. People believe Diana's death was an accident, he says. Maybe it was. But if it was an accident long in the making. And in his quietest moments, Andrew still hears Camilla's words echoing like a ghost. It's her, or the crown. For decades, Andrew Parker Bowles kept his silence. He moved through life as a man of discretion, as expected of someone raised in the corridors of British high society. He had been a soldier, a courtier, and perhaps most infamously, the man who had watched his wife's heart belong to someone else. For years, he bore his own burdens quietly, even as the world obsessed over the love triangle between Charles, Diana, and Camilla. But now, so many years after the dust seemed to settle, Andrew has chosen to break his silence. Why? The answer, as he tells it, is not simple. It's not about revenge, Andrew begins, his voice low. It's not about clearing my name either. It's about truth, the truth I tried so hard to ignore for years. I can't ignore it anymore. For years, Andrew believed that silence was survival. In the rarefied world of Britain's aristocracy, discretion is not just a virtue, it's a requirement. One does not betray confidences. One does not speak out against the crown. And one certainly does not air the family's dirtiest secrets for the world to hear. It started with the boys, he admits. Watching Harry and William grow up without their mother, watching the toll it's taken on them, made me realize the magnitude of what happened. They lost her too soon. And maybe it didn't have to be that way. Andrew also speaks of his own aging, of the creeping awareness that his time is finite. When you get older, you start asking yourself, what will I leave behind? What will people remember me for? I didn't want my legacy to be silence. Yet the decision to speak did not come easily. Andrew feared the backlash from those still loyal to Camilla and Charles. He feared the repercussions of challenging the institution that had shaped and constrained so much of his life. They'll call me a liar, he says matter-of-factly. They'll say I'm making it up for attention, that I'm bitter or jealous. But I know what I saw. I know what I heard. In private moments, Andrew reflects on the many times he chose not to act, the conversations he overheard, the warnings he ignored, the nights when Camilla's words chilled him, yet he poured another drink and said nothing. I was complicit in my silence, he admits. And that's something I'll have to live with. Part of Andrew's motivation stems from what he describes as the rewriting of history. They've turned Camilla into this sympathetic figure, he says. The dutiful wife who endured so much to finally find happiness. But that's not the whole story. The public deserves to know what really happened behind closed doors. Andrew also speaks of Diana, a woman he barely knew but whose life and death haunted him all the same. She wasn't perfect, he says softly, but she was young, vulnerable, and in way over her head. And the people who should have protected her instead, well, they did the opposite. The decision to speak came to a head one evening, as Andrew sat alone in his study, staring at a photograph of his younger self and Camilla. He thought about how different life might have been if things had gone another way. Maybe if I'd said something back then, it would have made no difference, he reflects. But maybe it would have. Andrew describes his confession as both a burden lifted and a dangerous act. I'm not naive, he says. I know the monarchy survives by burying its secrets. I know they'll come for me in their own way, quietly, methodically. But I don't care anymore. Someone has to tell the truth. When asked why now, why after so many years, Andrew's answer is deceptively simple. Because Diana can't speak for herself. Because the boys deserve to know. Because the public deserves to know. And because I'm tired of carrying this alone. As Andrew's words spread, the reactions are predictably polarized. Some hail him as a courageous whistleblower, finally shining a light on the dark corners of the monarchy. Others dismiss him as a bitter old man, seeking relevance in his twilight years. But Andrew insists he is not seeking fame or sympathy. "This isn't about me," he says. "It's about a woman who was loved by millions and betrayed by the very people who should have protected her. And it's about ensuring her story isn't sanitized for the sake of convenience." Andrew Parker Bowles has no illusions about what will follow his revelations. He expects denials, character assassinations, and whispers in the corridors of power. But he no longer fears them. "I've lived in silence for too long," he says. "It's time to speak, even if it costs me everything." When Andrew Parker Bowles' revelations finally reached the public, they exploded like a firestorm. Newspapers that had once celebrated the refined discretion of the British upper class now carried front-page headlines in bold, accusing fonts. "Camilla's ex-husband breaks silence. Was Diana's fate sealed?" Television anchors delivered the story with a mixture of shock and grim fascination. Social media lit up in a frenzy as millions debated the unthinkable. Had the monarchy's inner circle truly played a role in pushing Diana toward her tragic end? For many, the reaction was visceral. Outside Kensington Palace, a small crowd gathered almost immediately, laying fresh flowers beneath the black wrought iron gates, just as they had in the days after Diana's death decades earlier. Handwritten notes appeared overnight. "We still remember you, Diana," one read. Another, more pointed, said, "She didn't stand a chance. And now we know why." Andrew's voice, aged and steady, echoed in radio interviews and online clips. "I'm not saying they staged the crash," he repeated carefully. "But they set the stage for it. The pressure, the media chaos, the emotional isolation. It was a perfect storm, and they let it happen." The public's grief turned swiftly to outrage. "It feels like a betrayal all over again," said one mourner in London's Hyde Park, clutching a framed photo of Diana. "She trusted them. We trusted them. And all this time, they were tearing her apart from the inside." In cafes and pubs across Britain, conversations grew heated. "She was hunted," muttered an elderly man in Yorkshire. "Like a fox. And they're still sitting on their thrones as if nothing ever happened." "She knew," a younger woman countered, tears in her eyes. "Diana tried to tell us. That Panorama interview, they called her paranoid. But she was warning us. She was warning the world." The monarchy, long accustomed to weathering storms of public criticism, found itself under an unusually harsh glare. Royal aides issued carefully worded denials. "These claims are baseless and deeply hurtful," read one statement from Clarence House. "Her Majesty the Queen Consort has always conducted herself with the utmost dignity and respect. Suggestions to the contrary are entirely false." But the words rang hollow for many. If it's false, why does it feel so true? Asked a woman interviewed outside Buckingham Palace. "Everything fits now. The coldness after Diana's death. The way Camilla slipped into her role. It all fits." For Andrew Parker Bowles, the reaction was overwhelming. He had expected backlash. Indeed, he had braced for it. What he had not anticipated was the sheer tidal wave of emotion his confession unleashed. Supporters sent him letters thanking him for his courage. Critics accused him of treachery, calling him a bitter old man seeking to tarnish the crown's reputation. "You're destabilizing the country," one anonymous email warned him. "Do you really want to be responsible for bringing down the monarchy?" But Andrew stood firm. "I didn't make these choices," he told one interviewer. "They did. All I've done is speak the truth about what I saw and heard." The shockwaves were felt far beyond Britain. In Paris, where Diana had drawn her last breath, mourners once again left flowers at the entrance to the Pont de l'Alma tunnel. In America, talk show hosts dissected Andrew's claims with breathless urgency. "Was Diana's death really an accident?" asked one popular anchor. "Or was it the tragic consequence of a system designed to crush anyone who defies it?" The world seemed divided into two camps: those who believed Andrew's revelations confirmed their darkest suspicions, and those who clung fiercely to the idea of the royal family as a stabilizing force, incapable of such cruelty. But even among the monarchy's staunchest defenders, there was an undercurrent of unease. "What if he's telling the truth?" whispered a retired courtier to a journalist. "What if the institution we've spent our lives protecting isn't worth protecting at all?" Inside the palace, sources reported a growing sense of panic. Meetings were held behind closed doors. Crisis management teams were called in. The Queen Consort, Camilla herself, reportedly refused to comment publicly, but those close to her described her as deeply shaken. "They'll ride it out," Andrew predicted in a rare moment of cynicism. "They always do. The monarchy has survived wars, scandals, abdications. It'll survive this too. But maybe, Just maybe not without a scar this time. As public protests grew and calls for transparency reached Parliament, Andrew began receiving requests for further interviews, even a book deal. But he hesitated. "This isn't about profit," he said firmly. "It's about truth. And if telling it shakes the foundations of the monarchy, so be it." For a public still mourning Diana decades after her death, the anger was personal. "They silenced her once," said a young woman holding a candle outside Kensington Palace. "We can't let them silence her again." And so the outrage burned on, fueled by memories of the princess who had captured the world's heart, and the man who now claimed that heart had been deliberately broken long before it ever stopped beating. The British monarchy is an institution built on centuries of power, tradition, and resilience. It has survived abdications, divorces, and scandals that could have destroyed lesser dynasties. But Andrew Parker Bowles's revelations had struck a nerve deep within its foundations, and for the first time in years, the palace moved not with quiet detachment, but with deliberate urgency. Behind the high gates of Clarence House and Buckingham Palace, crisis meetings were convened at once. Senior advisors, communication strategists, and trusted courtiers gathered in dimly lit rooms to craft a response that would contain the firestorm before it engulfed the crown. "The first rule is simple," one veteran advisor reportedly said. "We don't dignify the claims with specifics. Deny broadly, pivot gracefully, and remind the world of the monarchy's stability." Andrew Parker Bowles is just noise. But deep down, they all knew this wasn't just noise. This was dangerous. The counteroffensive begins. Within 48 hours of Andrew's interview, a series of carefully worded statements began to flow from the palace. "It is deeply saddening to see unfounded and irresponsible claims being circulated about Her Majesty the Queen Consort," read the first release. "The royal household stands united in its commitment to public service and will not be distracted by fabrications designed to tarnish reputations and destabilize the institution." It was a textbook response, firm, dignified, and devoid of detail. Yet it failed to quell the growing outrage. Next came the media offensive. Longtime royal biographers and sympathetic journalists were mobilized. Articles appeared in prominent newspapers casting doubt on Andrew's credibility. "A bitter man in his twilight years. Why Andrew Parker Bowles's claims shouldn't be trusted," blared one headline. "Camilla's dignity amidst unfounded attacks," read another. On television, familiar royal commentators made the rounds, shaking their heads solemnly. "Mr. Parker Bowles is clearly grappling with his own past," said one. "It's tragic that he's chosen to lash out in this way, but it's important to remember, these are his recollections, not facts." Andrew watched the campaign unfold with grim familiarity. "They're doing exactly what I expected," he said in a quiet interview. "They're discrediting me. It's the same playbook they used on Diana. Paint her unstable, paint her emotional, and wait for the public to turn." Behind closed doors. But behind the palace's public calm, there was turmoil. Sources close to Camilla described her as deeply unsettled by Andrew's words. "She's furious, but she won't show it," one confidant said. "Camilla knows how to play the long game. She'll let the staff handle the initial mess, but make no mistake, she'll be orchestrating the counterattack." Andrew, meanwhile, began receiving subtle warnings. First, there were the phone calls. Polite but firm voices advising him to reconsider his decision to speak further. "You've said enough," one caller told him. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be." Then came the threats, more veiled but unmistakable. "Think of your family, Andrew," read one anonymous letter. "There's no need for them to be dragged into this." Andrew recognized the tactics. He had seen them before. "This is how they operate," he said. "They don't send assassins or spies. They send lawyers, advisors, and whispers in the right ears. And suddenly, your whole life starts falling apart." Public reaction splinters. As the palace fought back, public opinion became more polarized. For some, the monarchy's counteroffensive only fueled their suspicions. "Why are they so desperate to silence him if it's all lies?" asked one protester outside Buckingham Palace. "What are they hiding?" Others, however, began to waver. "Maybe Andrew is exaggerating," said a man interviewed on the streets of Edinburgh. "He was married to her. Of course he's bitter. That doesn't mean there was some grand conspiracy." Social media became a battleground. Hashtags like #JusticeForDiana and #ExposeThePalace trended for days, countered by #StandWithTheRoyals and #AndrewLies. Andrew's resolve. Despite the mounting pressure, Andrew refused to back down. "They can smear me all they want," he told a journalist. "It won't change what I know. It won't change what happened." But friends close to him began to worry. He received unexpected visits from people he hadn't seen in years, former colleagues, old family friends, each gently advising him to step back for his own good. "They'll destroy you if you keep this up," one warned. "You think you're untouchable, Andrew, but you're not." Andrew's reply was simple. Neither was Diana. A dangerous game. As the weeks passed, the palace's strategy grew sharper. Andrew's finances came under scrutiny. Old stories about his personal life began surfacing in tabloids. "Notice how suddenly there's all this interest in my past?" he asked bitterly. "That's no accident." And yet, despite the pressure, Andrew continued speaking. His voice was steady, but inside he felt the weight of the war he had unleashed. "I'm not sure how this ends," he admitted. "But I know how silence ends. It ends with regret. And I have enough of that already."